Oh, okay. All right, we're live. Here we are. So I'm a little disappointed, Catherine, that you don't have a big poster of your book kind of behind me. So
yeah, we should have sorted that out, shouldn't we? Like posters, you know, those things that I don't know what you call those, like everyone has at display stands, you know?
oh,
like,
the little the stand-up banner or something like that. Yeah.
Posters, yeah. Tapestry of the book cover, you know.
I mean, you're so fancy with your beer already, and maybe I'm giving away a little bit too much, but
yeah, I've got my
okay.
snap. I'm going to start drinking it yet until we've done.
Excellent. All right, so we'll just give it like another minute if that's okay. We'll just let any kind of stragglers from the waiting room come in. For those of you who are here right now, just so you're aware, this is a webinar format, is that, you know, so nobody can kind of interrupt right now, but we'll be happy to, Dr. Maud would be happy to take your questions at the end. I'll do a very brief introduction in just a minute, and then we'll listen to Catherine kind of talk about her book, and then the Q&A, the floor will kind of be open, and I'll just keep an eye on things and make sure that that we call on people and questions are brought to the fore. I should make you aware too is that if you look at the bottom of your screen, there is a live transcript for closed captioning. If you are interested in that, you just click that button and turn it on or turn it off, kind of depending on your own needs and preferences. But if anybody has any questions or anything like that, you can send me a direct message through the chat or just post something there and I'll see it. So, all right. So I think we're ready to go.
I love your mug.
Thank you. Yes, I'm drinking tea too. Usually I'm a coffee drinker, but I thought it would be appropriate that I have some tea. Yeah, I was thinking about drinking a beer, but I thought like, maybe not. It's kind of early here in the States, so yeah, maybe afterwards.
Yeah, I think I have some early morning attendees coming from the West Coast as well. So maybe it's not, not an ideal time for them either.
You know, it's like it's 6 o'clock somewhere, right? So that's right.
Absolutely.
All right. So, I mean, if it's okay, I think we'll get going. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's my great pleasure to be able to host this on behalf of the Department of Religion and Culture here at Virginia Tech. I've known and worked with Dr. Maud for a little while now, and it was when this opportunity became available, I was really happy that we were able to kind of help out. But I have a very brief role here. Again, is the highlight is Dr. Maud's amazing, wonderful new book. Addressing Women in Early Medieval Religious Texts, which we'll get to in just a second. So my name again is Matthew Gabriel. I'm the chair of the Department of Religion and Culture. I'm a professor of medieval studies here at Virginia Tech, and it is our pleasure to welcome you. But again, the real highlight here is our presenter and her amazing new book just out with Boydell this year. In fact, just out very, very recently, which is the whole point of the book launch. Dr. Maud took her PhD from King's College, London in 2017, and she is now an assistant professor at the American University in Beirut, and is now a gender integration faculty advisor, taking on a new role in addition. Her book is wonderful. If you haven't picked it up, you've seen kind of the ads, hopefully online. You can get it at a nice discount thanks to Boydell and the International Medieval Congress at Leeds, who's also kindly I guess, co-sponsoring this event as well. But the thing that really impressed me as I was reading through it is that the way that she takes women in early medieval Europe seriously, by using forms of address towards women to really get at the ideas of women's lives. And I think it's a really critical and a fascinating intervention that anyone interested in the Middle Ages, kind of generally, not just on early medieval England or something like that, or literature, will really benefit from taking a look at. So, but I have talked enough, so I will turn it over to Dr. Maud. Please join me in welcoming her as we hear more about her book.
Matt, thank you so much. I am really, really grateful to you for for managing this for me and for setting this up so that I could have the closed captioning. I'm going to do a little bit of thanking to start with, and then I'm going to talk just for about 10 minutes about the book. But just to start with, thank you all so much for being here. I'm really, really happy to see you all, and I'm really, really excited to be finally launching this book. It's been a long time coming. So I am going to share my screen with you. So thanks everyone for being here. If any of you are on Twitter, I'm at KRMaud, so feel free to tweet. Thank you, first of all, to the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at the American University of Beirut and its Dean, Nadia Sheikh, for supporting my work and the work on this book with a long-term faculty development grant and also a junior faculty research leave. I wouldn't have been able to finish this book without that time. I want to thank Diane Watt, my editor, and Caroline Palmer, my editor at Boydell & Brewer, and all the team at Boydell & Brewer. As you can see, they've done an amazing job with the cover, and they've also been really helpful throughout the whole process. I'd like to thank colleagues and friends, many of you are here, at King's College London, Swansea University, and the American University of Beirut. And a special mention goes to my graduate assistant, Riwa Rukos, who's here. Thank you, Riwa, for helping me write the index, which, as many of you know, is a thankless task. I'd like to thank my friends in the UK and Lebanon, Dana Oswald and CJ Jones, to whom the book is dedicated, my writing group through the Society for Medieval Feminist Scholarship, and also my whole family and my partner, Fuad Masalem, to whom the book is also dedicated. I thought I might only write one, so I needed to get everybody in. Before I talk about the book a little bit, I just wanted to show you the cover image. And I wanted an image showing a moment of address because that's what the book is about. And I wanted an image also that was from the time and the place that I discuss in the book. Eventually, after many, many hours on library websites, I found this really lovely image of an angel addressing the three Marys at the tomb of Christ. So he's holding out his hands, you can see, to address them and to bless them. And the image is from the Missal of Robert of Jumièges, and it was produced at Canterbury in the early 11th century, which is about the same time as the sermons that I'm about to talk about were written. Thank you very much to the Municipal Library in Rouen, who allowed me to use this image for free, in return only asking for a copy of my book, which obviously I was very excited to give them. So if anyone's looking for images, the French libraries are extremely generous. I would recommend looking there. So I'm going to just talk for about 10 minutes now about the book, and then we can move on to some questions. My book begins with a sermon. In around 990, Ælfric of Eynsham wrote a homily for the Feast of the Purification of Mary, bearing in mind his mixed congregation of monks, laymen, and laywomen. In the homily, he tells his congregation about the widow Anna, who lived with a man for 7 years and then remained a widow for 84 years. She loved fasting and prayer, and she never left the temple to go wandering across the land. The story of Anna, Ælfric thought, had particular resonance for one part of his audience. Behail je wif, and understandeth who behere ariten is. Take heed, women, and understand what is written about her. Lay women, listen, pay attention. This part of the story, this one is for you. Ælfric kept these women in mind when he was writing, and when he came across this particularly salient example, he took the time to draw their attention to it. He provided a script for these women's lives, recognizing their particular situation as Christian women and providing advice aimed specifically at them. Keeping this lay female audience in mind, though, we can question Ælfric's knowledge of their lives and their concerns. As a pious laywoman in Ælfric's church, probably married to a man, what use is Ælfric's advice to remain a widow? This advice leaves the woman with no other option than to wish her husband dead. Can she not behave well as a Christian and be married? Was there no way for a married woman to be addressed as a Christian subject in her own right? The moment of address in this sermon is an intimate knowledge claim that provides a script for women's behaviour in the world. By looking at forms of address in texts like this, I show we can locate the horizons of possibility for women's lives as Christians, which possibilities are open for them and which ones are closed. In some cases, the intimate knowledge claim of the address succeeds. The address recognises women as full Christian subjects in their own right. In other cases, this intimate knowledge claim fails, as it does not, perhaps cannot, recognise women's experiences. For example, in this homily, Ælfric fails to imagine a married woman who can successfully operate as a Christian subject. From the address itself, it's possible to see which texts provide expansive possibilities for women's Christian lives and which texts actively foreclose those possibilities. My book focuses on moments of address in early medieval religious texts from England and Scotland, ranging chronologically from late 10th century Old English homilies to Aelred's De Institutione Inclusarum in the 12th century. You can see that in the timeline here on the PowerPoint. In the book, I take the text claims to address women seriously and ask what kinds of lives they imagine for their addressees. To address someone is an intimate act. The male writer, in that moment of address, creates a relationship with their female addressee. The address could be a personal one, my sister, my beloved, my friend, or a general one, right? You women, you nuns, you widows. But in either case, the terms of address used claim intimate knowledge of the text addressee and her relationship to the writer. This relationship attempts to define how the women should be, what they should do, how they should behave, what kinds of things they should focus on. When we don't have substantial evidence of women's writing, focusing on these texts that address women directly allow us access to the scripts through which women were encouraged to compose their lives. My book focuses on this period between about 990 and about 1160, because in this period in Britain, we have very little evidence of women writing themselves. There are some letters from, for example, Matilda of Scotland, who I talk about in the book, and there are a wide range of anonymous texts which could have been written by women, but we don't have any longer texts written by named women. This lack of evidence was the starting point for the book. Without an archive of texts written by women, how do we go about studying their lives? I chose to answer this question by focusing on texts addressed to women. This increases the archive considerably, as you can see on this slide. Here are all the texts that I worked on during the book. To ensure that it made sense to compare the texts across, I focused particularly on texts addressed to women that are concerned with women's religious lives. I concentrate on these religious texts because they are explicitly instructional. They address women directly, and they want to tell them what to do. I'm interested in how women are told to behave, and that's the central concern of religious texts. There are also more religious texts addressed to women, probably because of this interest in shaping their readers and their hearers. My archive, therefore, includes all of the texts commissioned by or directly addressed to women in the period 990 to 1160 in Britain that are centrally concerned with how women should live Christian lives. Curating the texts in this way allows me to focus on continuity across the period and identify 2 centuries of women's involvement in commissioning and editing these texts. In past scholarship, the Norman Conquest, it's about here, 1066, has often been treated as a major break in the condition of women. The traditional narrative suggests that before the conquest, women had more agency over their lives, whereas after the conquest, more repressive laws were in place. That has already been challenged in scholarship, but concentrating on the period 990 to 1160 allows me to avoid a kind of scholarly break and focus on continuities. It also means I can work both on texts in Old English and texts in Latin. To be addressed in a way that is recognizable is to be acknowledged as a subject. From the Saints' Lives commissioned by Wilton and Barking Abbeys, to Aelred's sister's impassioned requests for a text written for her, Some of the women that I discuss in this book were interested in having text written for them and addressed to them, and I take this desire seriously. Conversely, some of the men that I discuss here were interested in writing text to women about how they should be. For example, the sermons that I talked about at the beginning, and Gauchelin's letter to Eve, which I talk about in chapter 2, whether the women wanted to read them or not. Thinking about address as an organising principle allows me to investigate women's involvement in literary culture in a nuanced and fine-grained way that demonstrates both women's desires, women's very real desires for religious dialogue, and the ways in which male authors desired to control women's lives through one-directional address. In the Alfrician homilies in chapter 1 that I started by talking about, the addresses to women do not recognise women as Christian subjects. Their addresses to women shy away from women's real lives. They can't imagine what it's like to be a woman, and so they cannot address women successfully. These homilies, the most public address to women in the period, are copied throughout the 11th and into the 12th century, and so they provide a backdrop to the other texts that I look at in the book. Against this backdrop, the texts in chapters 2 to 4 evidence women attempting to be addressed in their own right. This desire for intimate address manifests in many different ways. Women rewrite texts to address themselves, the Regularis Concordia, the Rule of Benedict. They commission texts, Aelred's sister commissioning the De Institutione Inclusarum, Queen Matilda, the nuns of Wilton and Barking. They copy texts that do address them directly. We see this in the nuns of Wilton and Barking, the scriptrix at Nunaminster, who I'll talk about in a moment. And they create intimate relationships with their confessors in an attempt to be addressed as full Christian subjects. Christina, Margaret, Aelred's sister, Eve. Not all of these attempts are successful, but all of them make clear these women's desires to be taken seriously as Christian women, to be both seen and addressed in their own right. By attending to whether women were involved in the production of texts that address them, whether by commissioning, copying, or rewriting, we can see which scripts women valued and which they attempted to follow. The book ends as it began, with another sermon. In the early 12th century, a nun sat down at Nunaminster in Winchester to copy out a sermon for Christmas Day, bearing in mind the mixed congregation of nuns, monks, and clerics who would hear it. In her hand, that sermon, De Natale Domini, on the birth of the Lord, begins with a tripartite individual address to fratres dilectissimi, most beloved brothers, virgines, virgins, and clerici, clerics, and goes on to address all three groups collectively as plebs ecclesiastici discipline, people of ecclesiastical discipline. The large manuscript containing the sermon, now Bodley MS 451, was designed for public instruction and probably read aloud collectively by the nuns. As a sermon collected in a Nunaminster manuscript by a self-named scriptrix, female scribe, De Natale Domini provides a view of women as a key part of the monastic familia, working together with clerics and monks to celebrate one of the most important moments of the Christian calendar together. I could give a lot more examples, but I'm going to leave that for you to ask me about in the chat. Women's literary culture was created through women seeking to be taken seriously, an intimacy which they couldn't find in the majority of texts addressed to them. Even when we can't be certain that women selected or copied texts, as with this Nunaminster example, we can discover and understand women's desire to be included in the written world as they commissioned works that address them as a central part of religious life. Attending to address is one way of attending to women in the past, and one way, I think, of recognizing their lives. Thank you all so much for being here to celebrate the book with me. I have, courtesy of my father, a book beer to drink now I've finished my speech. So please join me in a glass of your drink of choice. And I very much look forward to your questions. If you want to buy the book, there is 40% off and free shipping with the promo code BB870 at Boyd Ellen Brewer. So buy early, buy often. And it's the noise of the beer opening. Oh, Cheers. Thank you all for coming.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine. So just a reminder, please use the raise hand icon and I'll be happy to unmute you. We already have a couple people queued up for questions. So I missed it because I was turning on my thing. Did you get a drink at least, Catherine, before we get to questions? You did? Okay. All right. Excellent. Our first... Excellent. Our first question is coming from Nanette Stasko. So let's see. There you go. All right, Nanette, I think you can unmute yourself and you're welcome to ask your question.
Hi, sorry, I think I was on mute. Hello. That was really enjoyable. Thank you so much. And so I'm not a scholar in the area, but I was curious about your statement that women weren't considered Christian. I mean, did they participate in mass and take, communion, or would those writers and authors have also sought to exclude them from that part of Christianity?
That's a really great question, Nanette. So it's more that the status of Christian is an aspirational one for every Christian in the period, right? Everybody is striving to be a more perfect Christian. And when these writers are writing to women, not all of them, but these sermon writers in particular are writing directly to women, what they're saying is, oh, you need to be like this in this range of ways. And some of those ways are inaccessible to the women that they're writing. So if they say, oh, the perfect Christian is a widowed woman who stays at home, never goes out and prays all the time, and you are a married Christian woman with 3 children who has to work in the fields to make ends meet, the ways in which you can successfully be Christian are really limited by the kind of ways that they're talked about. These women were expected to attend mass, absolutely expected. Taking communion is a kind of tricky one in this period. Lay communion isn't mandated until 1215, yearly lay communion. So depending on where you were, especially depending on where you were in England, it could vary really wildly. Ælfric seems to expect the people that he talks to be taking communion probably at Easter. And maybe at other times, but that was quite a big monastic center. If you live, in the middle of nowhere up a hill, the likelihood that you'll be regularly taking communion is quite small. And so that's also, we see, especially in the later Middle Ages, very, very interesting. We see people wanting to take communion much more regularly. But in the earlier Middle Ages, we don't see it so often. So when I say it was difficult for women to fully participate in Christianity, what I mean by that mostly is that these men had an assumption of what being a good Christian was that was quite exclusionary. It was difficult to achieve for your kind of standard medieval laywoman. Thank you. It was a great question.
Thank you.
I should unmute myself. So great, thank you. Our next question comes from Rami Khoury. There you go. And you can just unmute yourself and you should be able to ask your question.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. The cover of the book is quite spectacular, and I'm sure the inside is the same. And I've talked to you about this a little bit more, but I'm intrigued by the link between your current work as a professor of women and gender studies and this historical literary exploration that you've done. How have you, when you discuss this with your students in Beirut, maybe in other places, how do students today relate to this?
Oh, that's such a good question, Rami. And we talked about, so Rami is my colleague at AUB. We talked about this a little bit on a podcast that Rami hosts. I'll put a link to it in the chat when I can find it. So one thing that I find really exciting about working on the Middle Ages is that students assume that it will be completely irrelevant to their lives. Often I will get student feedback, and the student feedback will say, I thought that this would be really boring. I thought that I wouldn't enjoy this at all. And then over the course of the semester, they realize that a lot of the concerns that we see in texts of the Middle Ages, are still concerns that we have. So thinking about the work on the book, the central question of the book is, how can women be taken seriously? What does it mean to be talked to and talked about in a way that takes women's lives seriously? And I think for my students in Beirut, and when I've taught in the UK before, that's a question that's still very live. What does it mean in the UK and in Beirut, in Lebanon, in parliaments that are predominantly male still, in CEOs that are predominantly male? How does it look to take women doctors or women lawyers or women engineers seriously in their careers? And I think that one of the things that we see one of the things I think we see in the book is the ways that in this period women were copying things that address them, were commissioning things that address them, were finding ways within the system that they lived in to make their voices heard, to be heard, to be listened to. And I think that that is something that my students always find very, very relevant. There's also some fun bits. So chapter 4, Wilton Abbey. This is a section I teach to the students. One of the nuns has her own private zoo. So that's Edith of Wilton. She has her private zoo. It has a stag and a range of other wild creatures that eat out of her hands. The writer attempts to spin this as a kind of proto St. Francis moment, is a saint that is so holy that the animals flock to her. But my students always think of it as a kind of Disney princess moment for this saint, right? She has the birds landing on her hand, and but actually she just had loads of money, and so she has this private zoo. And so we have these kind of questions about, what does it mean to be a royal saint? What does it mean to kind of have money, to show off, to demonstrate your power in particular ranges of ways? And I think a lot of these questions are really live ones. Yeah, sorry, I went on a bit because I was excited. Thanks, Rami.
Great, thank you so much. Let's see here. Next question comes from Joe Coster. There you go, and you can unmute.
Hey, Catherine. First of all, I'm oohing and ahhing as I promised I would on Twitter. So, ooh, ah, this is so wonderful, and I have ordered the book. I'm very excited. One of the things that just struck me, because I've been doing some work recently on Hali Maithad and the text of the Catherine group, and how, again, these are female commissioned works with a certain amount of male address. And a lot of things, especially like in Hali Maithad, sounds exactly like these sermons. Yeah. And I'm wondering how much of that is a trope. And if the trope continues for 5 centuries, what does that tell us?
Wow, that's a wonderful question.
It's probably a whole second book.
I can hear my dad laughing from the other room because he knows that what that means is that I don't know the answer. I have some thoughts, but I don't think I have an answer for you, and maybe we should talk about this more at some point. But one of the things I think is that, I'm pointing, one of the things I think, and one of the arguments that the book makes, is that we should really see these Old English sermons that continue to be copied for 3 or 4 centuries, and then often translated into early Middle English and kind of rewritten and reworked, as a kind of basis for thinking about these other texts addressed to women, right? So when something like Holy Maidenhood is written, we might think about that as being influenced by these sermons that are being repeatedly copied. So Ælfric's sermons are copied all the way through until the 12th century. And a lot of the kind of moments and tropes from Ælfric's sermons kind of come back. And I think that the ways that sermon works address women there's so many sermons that haven't really been worked on, especially actually kind of 13th century sermons. So there's a kind of a gap in the sermon literature, or it has been seen as a gap, where we don't have a lot of new sermons being written. So the kind of 11th and 12th centuries, there are not loads of new sermons being written in the vernacular. But what is happening is that these Alfrician sermons are being copied and copied and copied. There's a section in the book where in chapter 1, at the end of chapter 1, where I talk about the way that these sermons are being repeatedly copied throughout this period. And so it makes me wonder, we have so many copies still, right? So if we think about the survival rates, there must have been so many more copies. And it does make me wonder whether these tropes that we see in these sermons are kind of making their way into other texts. So one of the things that I talk about is the way that De Institutione Inclusarum, which obviously right at the end of the period that I'm looking at, 1160-ish, a lot closer to Haile Maeshead, although still further away, picks up some of the elements of the sermons, right? And I think that maybe thinking about Old English and Latin together is a way of thinking that. But also I wonder if the kind of Old English sermons are being picked up in the early Middle English in a way that we haven't yet quite got the language to talk about. But I'd be really interested in talking to you about that, because I think it's really fascinating, actually, those links. Yeah.
I would love to talk to you more about it later, because there's some of the alliteration gets picked up and some other features of Old English prose style that does carry over. And so you start to wonder what all, I mean, 1160 to 1210 is not that far of a gap in the Middle Ages in terms of copying something. That's one scribe's life generation. So, but I will just say that my students love Haile Maeshead the way you say your students love Edith of Wilton, because they can't be convinced that a man could have written that description of pregnancy and morning sickness. And then I'm going like, no, in fact, it was a French bishop. And they're like, what?
Yeah, we assume he wasn't. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting moment in Holy Maidenhood, definitely, that moment where she's kind of green. And I think it's another one of those moments where we think about who these texts are written for, right? Because if you're a laywoman and if you have, 5 children and you're reading this description of pregnancy, or you're hearing this description of pregnancy is the worst thing that could ever happen to you, oh God. And when you have the child, your husband will come home and he'll shout at you, and the dog will chew your feet, and the baby will be crying, and you'll be making dinner, and your husband will be cross because the dinner's burned. And, it paints this kind of awful picture of married life. And you're thinking, is this for people who've already chosen it, or is this to try and persuade people into it? And I think that that's a kind of an interesting thing for us to think about. And how does that work with the sermons, right? Are the sermons supposed to give you an unattainable ideal, or are they supposed to make you think, oh, maybe I won't get married after all, right? Like what are they supposed to be doing? And I'm not totally sure on that.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Let's see, our next question is from Zachary Juliana. And you can unmute yourself.
Thank you. Well, first of all, congratulations, and I'm really looking forward to reading the book. I guess I have a sort of general question, which is related to texts that, ironically, of course, given the focus of the book, were not specifically written for women, but then were often read by mixed audiences. I partly work on the Homiliary of Paul the Deacon, which Ælfric drew on for his sermons. And you have a lot of sermons in there where the kind of ethical addresses or the addresses about Christian life are just so generalized. It's like, seek to exhibit faith, hope, and love, and then the social outworking of that is not, there's like nothing there, basically. There's a lot of missing content. And you get that in biblical commentaries too, that were, copied in men's and women's religious houses, where some of the ethical things are related to states of life and stuff, but a lot of it is just very generalizable. And if I can just add on one last thing, the reason it occurs to me is because of a comment I heard Beth Allison Barr making about sort of later medieval sermons that address women, where she said her impression is that there are at times these kind of generalized addresses that don't seek to be too prescriptive, even in texts that are addressed specifically to women. And so I think she's working on a book which is women in English sermons in the late Middle Ages, something like that. So anyway, that's just sort of a nexus of thoughts, which I apologize for just sort of throwing in your direction, but just interested to hear your thoughts. And yeah, again, really looking forward to reading the book. So congratulations.
Thank you for coming. I think I'm really interested in the ways that address in sermons works. It's something that I think there's not a lot of work on sermons, especially Old English sermons. Brandon Hawke just wrote a really great book about Apocrypha in Old English sermons predominantly, although not exclusively in sermons. And that's a really wonderful book, but there isn't as much work. So I'm really excited to hear that you're working on it, that you're working on the homilary. So I'm kind of interested in the idea of address in sermons in general. One of the things that is often said about Old English sermons is that they have an inclusive address. So they tend to be addressed to either most beloved men or beloved men, or to beloved brothers, right? And so we assume the beloved brothers is likely to be a more monastic setting, although it isn't always. But the kind of most beloved men is interesting because when these sermons were first edited, and I think a lot of people would still say this, that they said, oh, well, most beloved men, what this is everybody in the congregation, right? But in the book, I talk about some sermons. There's a couple of anonymous sermons, so Blickling 10 and Homem 8, which is it's one of those quite weird Old English sermons that's only been edited like once in 1971 in someone's master's dissertation. So I think it also demonstrates we need more editions of things. But anyway, those two sermons, they start with an address to most beloved men, and then they say, by which we mean, and then they have a whole list of people, right? So they say, most beloved men, by rich and poor, men and women, young and old, right? And so they have this moment where they're like, most beloved men, oh, but you might not feel included by that. And so they explicitly address people. And I think that when we see that in sermons without some of those tags, what that perhaps makes us think is that isn't an automatically inclusive address. That isn't automatically addressing everybody in the congregation, everybody in the room. It is in fact a kind of, at least partly, an exclusive address, right? That is particularly talking to the Christian men in the room. But I also think that so the Latin sermon that I was talking about, De Natalia Domini, it has this beginning address to monks, virgins, and clerics, right? Brothers, virgins, and clerics is how it starts. But the kind of prescriptions that it makes for people's lives, I wonder perhaps because of that kind of inclusive starting, are very, very general and actually kind of lovely. It's a lovely Christmas sermon. It tells us to think, just looking at it. So it says, let us take wayfarers into our homes, feed the hungry, give help to those in prison, visit the sick and redeem captives, and share with them out of our own store. In some, let us have the peace of Christ in our hearts for all men and abide peacefully. We will be co-heirs with Christ if we have suffered with him in this world, just as he suffered on our behalf. Right. And so we have this really interesting moment, I think, and perhaps this is something that I would think about in relation to the homilary that you're talking about, this really interesting moment where this isn't an address just to, it isn't telling specific people to do specific things. It's saying we are all Christians. We are all, it addresses them as people of ecclesiastical discipline. And as people of ecclesiastical discipline, monks, nuns, and clerics, you have a responsibility to do these things. And that responsibility isn't different if you're male or female, right? If you're a man or a woman, it isn't a different moment. It's the same responsibility. We have this responsibility to look after people in need. And I find that really interesting in relation to the sermons. that in some of them we have this very kind of exclusionary address, and in some of them, so for example, it addresses most beloved men at the beginning, but then when they're translating the Ten Commandments, it translates don't have sex with another man's wife using the same man, right? So this suggests that the Old English man really does have most of the connotations of the contemporary English man, right? So yeah, I'm very, I could talk about this forever. I'm very interested in sermons. I think maybe that's the next project. But thanks so much for coming and for asking your question. I don't want to, I think we have some other people.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. We do have a couple of people who put questions in text, and so I'll read them out if that's okay. First one comes from Abigail Williams, who said, "Thank you so much for the book. As a student, I'm very excited to get my hands on it. I wonder if you had looked at the period, the earlier period at all, about 600 to 800, and if there's a difference between the number of examples of women as addressees before and after 990. Is there a wealth of examples just from the later period? Kind of just curious about this."
Oh, yeah, really good question. So I have done some work on the earlier period. So predominantly I'm an early medievalist. I'm an Old English specialist, and I work predominantly with earlier material. And as in specifically my teaching, I teach mostly in the earlier period. One of the things that is kind of interesting about that earlier period is that we do have not lots and lots, but more text addressed specifically to women, not text written by women, sorry, so by named women. So for example, we have the life of Winibald and Willibald by Hugeberg, who's a nun in the early medieval period in England, and she writes this amazing travel narrative about their visit to Syria. It's very, very much worth a read. I'm hoping Diane and I had plans at some point to edit it, so maybe that will happen at some point. I'd like to. But it has this wonderful moment where she writes about their journey, and they end up as the captives of this kind of Syrian prince, and they seem to be kind of held very luxuriously. They're allowed baths twice a week, and they're kind of escorted through the streets. And Hugeberg tells this story of all of them walking through the streets and being kind of waved at by the locals as these marvelous visitors from abroad. I'd really recommend reading that if you haven't. It's great if you're gonna teach medieval things. But also there are a lot of letters. So we have all of the missionary letters from the missions in Germany back to England. I've edited Birgith's letters to Balpard for Medieval Feminist Forum. So those are kind of Latin letters written by women back to a brother in England. And then there were also letters by nuns and abbesses, both to each other. There's a very interesting letter. This doesn't happen very often in the Middle Ages, or it's not kept. We assume it happens much more, but we don't have a lot of examples of it, of an abbess in Germany writing to a sister abbess about the pilgrimage route down to Italy, and how we would go about getting down to Italy, and will you send us a letter of introduction to so and so, right? So we have kind of more. But we also, broadly speaking, and I know I'm making some big generalizations, have more anonymous texts from the earlier period, right? So the whole corpus of Old English poetry, almost entirely anonymous. We have a couple of poems that have named poets, but broadly speaking, they're anonymous. I always correct my students when they call anonymous he, right? We know that there are scribes writing in this period who are female. We know that there are female poets. There's Muriel, the famous Latin poetess of Wilton Abbey. So the whole of northern France at one point is writing to Wilton Abbey to ask Muriel to write poems for them, right? So we have all of these kind of French bishops so this is the 11th century. We have all of these French bishops writing to Wilton Abbey saying, please, Muriel, write us a poem. Like I really need to hear your beautiful voice. But unfortunately, we don't have any of her poems, right? So we know her name, and we know her great fame. She was really, really, people 2 or 3 French bishops wrote poems about how beautiful Muriel's poetry was, but we don't have any of it left, right? And so the kind of short answer is the book is the length it is because I couldn't fit any more in. My original PhD proposal that became the book started with Aldhelm's De Virginitate, which is like 700-800, and then went all the way through to Holy Maidenhood. Right, so that was like 700 years, and I got into my first meeting with my supervisor Claire Lees, and she was like, "You know, you can't do this. This is too much." So you know, the book ends with a suggestion that people take this forward, and I hope people will take it back into the earlier period as well, because I'm very interested in the ways that Address to Women has this continuity that I argue for in this kind of 200-year period, but also I'm interested to know what changes, right? And I think we don't know that yet, and I'm hoping that some work will be done. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Our next question comes from Claire Poynton-Smith, and she asks, you spoke about how women are encouraged to follow these virtuous scripts with the widow as one presented ideal. One of her research interests at the moment is the lexical field of lust in late Old English and early Middle English saints' lives. Have you encountered any specific instructions to avoid lust and desire in your texts?
Yes, interesting. There's a really interesting bit in Vercelli 7. So Vercelli 7 is an anonymous Old English homily in what is called the Vercelli book, because it's currently in Vercelli in northern Italy. And there's a kind of interesting moment where, well, I'm going to just read it to you. There's like a very interesting moment in this homily. So the Old English sermon addressees, remember how Esau spent his days in persecution, and how the ones who before in that time were the children of God were captivated through the viewing of beautiful women and fell into hell. Remember also how they perished who with a lust of frenzy sought sex with men. So the argument that I make here is that you might assume that the warnings here about lust after both men and women, right? The viewing of beautiful women and the lusting of frenzy, seeking sex with men. You might assume that the warnings against lusting after men and women suggest that the kind of direct address in the homily applies to the whole mixed audience. But I think that the use of wad heotisnus willen, which means kind of mad or frenzied lust, kind of unusual lust, right, suggests that the addressee's desire for sex with men here is kind of is sinful in a different way, or is sinful in a kind of additional way to the desire for sex with women. So I think coming straight after this warning about beautiful women causing God's children to sin, perhaps they do that as well. That reads as an additional warning to men to avoid sex with women and with men. Right, so I think this is an interesting moment where men are being warned specifically not to lust after either women or men. But then later on in the same sermon, we have another really interesting moment where women are told off for bathing too much. So it says, why do you think to increase the health of your body with the smearing of unguents and frequent bathing and other softnesses? From these things comes sickness, not at all strength. If you put away these indulgences, the form of the body will be fairer than it was previously, right? So the women are told off for bathing too much, right? They're anointing themselves with unguents, they're moisturizing, it's terrible, stop. And the reason that they're told off for anointing themselves is that it makes the body sick. And what we later realize in the sermon is that the making the body sick here means that it makes both the women themselves more lustful and the men that look upon them more lustful, right? So it's women bathing is a problem because it makes them more prone to lust, and it makes men more prone to looking at them as well. And it links it through to gluttony. So it says, women, because of their soft lives, they are so fragile, because they are always inside and they do not do any heavy work, and they often bathe and smear themselves with spices, and they rest always on soft beds, right? And this is the kind of soft indulgence. And he says the soft indulgence of the body is also kind of gluttonous, right? It makes us and he says, from gluttony come those sinful desires, just as in stagnant water worms propagate. Right, so from the gluttony comes the lust, right? So Vercelli 7 is very interested in the kind of problems of lust, both for men and women, but the problems are quite different, right? The problems that it imagines will come from lust are quite different. Yeah, so Vercelli 7 is very interested in lust. Aelred De Institutione Inclusarum is also a text that is really, really centrally concerned with lusts of the body. He says that you have to avoid your members, uses this viris, it uses this kind of slightly strange word. He has to avoid your members getting excited. And he's speaking to women at this point, right? So it's kind of an interesting, I think, slippage between the writer and the addressee. You have to avoid your members getting overexcited, and and that is a real problem. Yes, I just put in the chat that it reminds me of St. Jerome's statement, he never bathed fully nude. Yeah, you have to really watch yourself. Nude bathing, like slippery slope, straight to hell, according to Vercelli, the Vercelli 7 homilist, right? It's just like you start out with a bit of moisturizer and then that's it.
Not only is the path to hell paved with good intentions, but with good moisturizer apparently too. So
apparently, so unguents.
The unguents.
Yeah. So that kind of feel free to email me and I can talk to you more about the kind of moments of lustful desire in the text. I'll put my email in the chat actually.
Great. I think we're unfortunately running a little bit low on time, but we do have one more question. So I think there's time for one more, if that's okay. And this question comes from Isabella Bolognese. Says, thank you so much for your presentation and your important work. She said, the question asker says, I was recently at Grauthal and read about a women's monastery there that was visited by Hildegard of Bingen when the abbess was having a hard time controlling her nuns. I haven't checked this, but apparently Hildegard wrote some harsh letters to the abbess telling her how to be more stern. So the question is, what are women's addresses to other women like in terms of tone? Are they different from men's?
Ooh. Hi, Isabella. Thanks for coming. There aren't that many from England. We have some, but not many. And most of them are actually earlier. So the ones that we do have of women writing letters to other women tend to be, they tend to be kind of similar in some ways to men writing to women, but also women writing to men, in the sense that one thing that's very, very important in the period, I mean, obviously I've been thinking mostly for the purposes of the book about the differences between women and men, but one thing that's really, really important, perhaps more important, is status, right? And so if you're an abbess writing to another abbess, you're writing kind of horizontally. And if you're an abbot writing to an abbess, you're also writing kind of horizontally. And we see these kind of issues of status come up all the time. So with the chapter 2, I talk about Aelred, who's a monk at Rievaulx in Yorkshire, an abbot, writing to his sister. And one of the things I think is really interesting about that address is that he writes really horizontally. He addresses his sister as a fellow spiritual director. He assumes that she will have a spiritual responsibility for women under her care, and that just as he has a spiritual responsibility for the men under his care, and also the woman, his sister in this case, that he's writing to, right? And so we see moments like that where status becomes kind of more important than gender, right? And separating those two things kind of isn't really possible, right? That you're not kind of either an abbess or a woman, right? You're both of those things at once. And so that's one of the things that I think is really interesting about all of these texts is that we have to bear in mind, and we have to bear in mind both the kind of relative statuses of the people involved, as well as their gender, and often as well as the language they're writing in. So a lot of these will be in Latin. We don't have any letters from this period written in Old English. There are moments in letters, moments in charters in Old English, but predominantly, and moments in wills where you get kind of snippets of Old English, but predominantly they'll be in Latin. We have a much larger Latin corpus, whereas in later periods we get more unofficial letters, we get more letters that are written in the vernacular, and so that kind of changes things a bit. But this is a kind of long way round of saying that there really aren't very many letters written from women to women in the period. When we get slightly later, so kind of 13th century, we start getting letters in French between women, between different nunneries. But from the period I look at, especially in England and Scotland, so we have more on the continent. So you'll see more in Germany. We have more women writing to other women, abbesses writing to other abbesses. But that's also partly a problem, as I know you know, Isabella, of survival, in the sense that the dissolution of the monasteries in England, Henry VIII, right? We don't have a lot of institutional continuity, whereas some of the monasteries in Europe will have been there kind of undisturbed since the 11th century. And so they have their own archives and they have their own kind of materials. And so the survival looks quite different. And we see that in particular in relation to German monasteries that have a lot of material, much, much more than we would have in England. Yeah. But I'm interested to think about that question a bit more. Thanks, Isabella.
This has been absolutely wonderful and fascinating, and just on behalf of, I will take liberties and say on behalf of the audience, which I'm sure is not exceeding their expectations, just say thank you for all of this. And I'm sure that all 32 attendees are going to go out and use that promo code and go buy your book right now. So, and if they're not, they should. So thank you so much to everybody for joining us. Thank you so much, Catherine, for presenting your work. I mean, it seems fascinating. So many lines of research and intersection, as we saw from the Q&A, with all sorts of different avenues and future possibilities for collaboration and things like that. So thank you, everyone. Take good care and enjoy your evening, day, or wherever you are.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Matt, for being a wonderful compere, being a wonderful chair. I couldn't have done it without all of you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. This was great.
My pleasure.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.